The dean's assistant called at 1:57 a.m. to ask whether I approved the additional guest billed to my spouse's conference suite. I had been awake long enough that the night had started to feel like a second job. My office at the university was quiet in the way only academic buildings can be quiet after midnight, air conditioning sighing through vents, the distant ping of an elevator settling, the soft, ceaseless fluorescent hum. On my desk, 2 stacks of papers leaned toward each other like exhausted arguments, grant revisions on one side, student drafts on the other. The only warm light came from my desk lamp, turning the scattered highlighters and paper clips into small, domestic artifacts. I was rereading the same paragraph of my own proposal for the 3rd time, not because it needed it, but because my mind kept wandering back to the same thought. Lena hadn't sounded like herself when she left. Lena Calloway, Dr. Lena Calloway, if we were being formal, was my wife and one of the most visible researchers in our department. She was brilliant in the specific way that made rooms rearrange around her, a quick mind, a steadiness under pressure, a laugh that always seemed to arrive half a second late as if she'd been weighing whether joy was efficient. For 7 years, our marriage had run on the same rhythms as our work, calendars, deadlines, mutual respect, small rituals. Coffee together at 6:30. A shared walk around the quad after dinner when the weather was kind. The habit of telling each other the truth even when it was inconvenient. So when she said, "Last week, I'm going to the Marlowe Symposium in Ravenshaw," I hadn't blinked. The Marlowe Symposium was real. Prestigious. 3 days of panels and networking and strategic dinners disguised as collegiality. She'd been invited to deliver a keynote and chair a session. What had snagged me wasn't the trip. It was the way she said, "It'll be intense," and then kissed my cheek as she packed, already turning away before I could meet her eyes. It was the way her phone stayed face down on the kitchen counter even while it vibrated, as if she didn't trust herself not to reach for it in front of me. It was the way she insisted, too quickly, that the hotel Wi-Fi was notoriously unreliable, as if she were laying down an explanation before a question had formed. I'd noticed those things and done what I usually do with uncertainty. I documented it in my head and said nothing. The call that came at 1:57 a.m. wasn't on my cell. It was on my office line, the old-fashioned kind with a physical handset and a blinking red light. No one called that number at this hour unless something was on fire. The phone rang again, sharp and insistent in the quiet. I picked up. "Professor Calloway's office," I said, and immediately hated the automatic formality, as if I could keep my life neatly categorized by job titles. A woman's voice answered, careful and practiced. "Dr. Nathan Calloway." "Yes. This is Sloane Mercer, executive assistant to Dean Halpern." She said it as if her name alone should be a credential. It probably was. "I apologize for the late hour. I'm calling because we've received an urgent communication from the Marlowe Symposium's host institution regarding billing authorization." Billing. The word made my shoulders tighten. Sloane continued, voice even. "The symposium concierge is requesting confirmation that you approve charges being billed under your shared faculty travel account for an additional guest in Dr. Lena Calloway's suite." My hand went cold around the receiver. I stared at my laptop screen, which had dimmed but not slept. It still displayed the same thing I'd been staring at on and off for hours, like my mind refused to let it vanish. A public photo. Tagged. Unapologetic. Lena, on a balcony with the city's harbor lights behind her, wearing a dress I'd never seen. She was laughing, not her polite professional laugh, but the open one she reserved for private moments. A man stood close beside her, one hand on the railing, the other resting casually at the small of her back. And I knew him. Gideon Rusk. Her former co-author. Her former mentor. The man who had once, before Lena and I met, been the gravitational center of her early career and, according to the stories she'd told me, the person who had blurred lines until she'd finally cut him off. The caption beneath the photo was not subtle. Some conversations pick up exactly where they left off. I remembered the moment I saw it earlier that evening, and the strange response my body had had, not heat, not shock, but a kind of stillness, as if my nervous system had decided that panic was a waste of energy. I forced my voice to stay calm. "Who contacted the dean's office?" I asked. "The symposium concierge," Sloane said. "They attempted an authorization and it was declined. They escalated because the booking was associated with the university travel line, and because Dr. Calloway has, a pause, paper shifting, reported that her access to funds has been intentionally restricted. So Lena had moved quickly. She'd taken the story to an authority before she took it to me. My mouth tasted metallic. Do you realize who is now involved? Sloane asked, and her tone wasn't accusatory. It was cautious, like someone approaching a lab spill. Yes, I said. I realize. But I hadn't, not fully, not until she said it out loud, additional guest in her suite. The language of bureaucracy turning my marriage into a line item. Sloane lowered her voice slightly. Dr. Calloway is currently in Ravenshore. She's indicated she's unable to check out or access transportation without the account being restored. The host institution is concerned about liability. They've asked whether the university will intervene. I listened to her and felt something in me settle, heavy and certain. It wasn't grief yet. It was recognition. Lena thought I wouldn't notice. Or if I did notice, she thought I'd prioritize appearances, our standing, her keynote, the department's reputation, over my own boundaries. She thought I would cover it up because that's what respectable people do. They don't make messes where colleagues can see. I swallowed. Has Lena explained why an additional guest is in the suite? I asked. Sloane hesitated. She said she ran into an old colleague unexpectedly. She emphasized it was not planned. Not planned. The classic phrasing of someone trying to reframe choices as weather. I looked again at the photo on my laptop. Gideon's hand on her back. Lena's head tilted toward him. The caption that practically announced, yes. This is happening. It hadn't looked unexpected. It had looked comfortable. I can send documentation, I said, and even as I said it, I recognized how strange my life had become, a husband offering evidence as if he were disputing an invoice, not a marriage. Sloane exhaled softly. Documentation would be helpful, she said. I want to be clear, I added. I have not restricted Lena's personal funds. I have restricted my authorization on a shared university travel account and our joint personal credit line due to suspicious and unauthorized usage. A pause. You froze the joint line? Sloane asked. Yes, I said. After confirming charges inconsistent with the stated purpose of the trip. Sloane's voice tightened into official neutrality. Understood. The dean will want to know whether you intend to restore access to resolve the immediate situation. I didn't answer immediately. Because I knew what she was really asking, will you quietly fix it so the university doesn't have to deal with the scandal of one of its stars being stranded because her husband stopped paying? I thought back to the last time I'd spoken to Lena before she left. She'd been folding a blazer into her suitcase, smooth and practiced. I'd leaned against the doorway and watched her. You excited? I'd asked. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It's good for the lab. Good for the next round of funding. Good for you, I'd said. Sure, she'd replied quickly. Too quickly. Then her phone vibrated on the bed. She'd glanced at it and flipped it face down with a casualness that felt rehearsed. Everything okay? I'd asked. Of course, she'd said, and she'd crossed the room and kissed me. Her lips were warm, but her gaze slid away as she did it, as if she couldn't hold the intimacy and the lie in the same moment. I'd told myself I was being paranoid. That academic stress makes people weird. That conferences are exhausting. But then, on day one, she texted me a photo of the hotel lobby, marble floors, an art wall, her reflection in the glass. Made it, she wrote. Long day. No colleagues in sight. On day two, she sent a selfie from a panel room, her badge visible, her smile careful. Packed schedule. Wi-Fi is trash. On day three, she stopped texting at all, but she didn't stop posting. I didn't see the posts at first because she didn't post to the places she usually posted. I saw them because Gideon did. Gideon's account was public, and someone in our department, one of my grad students, bless their obliviousness, had liked one of his photos, which pushed it into my feed. That's how I found the balcony picture. That's how I saw Lena's laugh. That's how my stomach went cold. After that, I did what I'm good at. I stayed quiet. I watched. I verified. At 9:11 p.m. I opened our joint credit card portal. I didn't hack anything. I didn't snoop in her phone. I simply looked at the account my name was legally attached to. There were the charges, clean and unambiguous: 2 breakfasts billed to the suite, 2 drink packages, a couple's massage at the hotel spa, a late-night room service order that included a second entree and 2 desserts. 2. Not a colleague dinner. Not a group tab. 2. And then the one that made my throat tighten: Harborline private car, transfer, 2 passengers. 2 passengers. The lie wasn't just that she was with Gideon. The lie was that she was letting me pay for the intimacy. That she assumed I would never check. I'd swallow it for the sake of her image. I didn't freeze the account in a fit of rage. I waited long enough to gather a clear pattern. I took screenshots. I exported statements. I saved the public posts with timestamps. Then, with the calmness of someone submitting a grant application, I made the calls. First, our bank, to flag suspicious international activity on the joint personal line. Second, the university travel office, to revoke my authorization on the shared faculty travel account. Lena had access because we'd linked our profiles years ago for convenience. Convenience is how boundaries rot. Third, the credit issuer, to lock the travel card tied to the joint line. I didn't touch my individual account. I wasn't trying to ruin her life. I was trying to stop funding the betrayal. Then I went to bed. The first message from Lena came at 6:03 a.m. Lena, my card isn't working. Did you change something? I didn't answer. At 6:27. Lena, Nathan. This is not funny. I'm in the middle of the symposium. At 6:50. Lena, call me. Then, an hour later, the tone shifted. Lena, the hotel is saying we have to settle the folio before we can check out. Please fix this. We. There it was, slipped into a sentence like an accidental confession. I didn't respond. By late afternoon, a new number called me, Ravenshore area code. I let it ring. Then an unfamiliar voice left a voicemail: Gideon. His voice was smooth, lightly amused, like a man who'd never had to pay for the damage he caused. Nathan, he said, as if we were colleagues. This is Gideon. Lena's stressed. There's been a mix-up with the account. Can you handle it? You're making this into a thing. A thing. Like my marriage was a minor administrative hiccup. I deleted the voicemail without replying. Not out of drama. Out of clarity. Now, in my office, Sloane Mercer was waiting for my answer. Ms. Mercer, I said. Please tell the dean that I will provide documentation of unauthorized usage. The university is not obligated to cover personal expenses incurred by an undisclosed guest. The hotel can work with Dr. Calloway and the other individual. I heard Sloane inhale. I will relay that, she said carefully. But, Dr. Calloway is a high-profile faculty member. There are reputational concerns. Of course there were. There always are. And this was the moment Lena had counted on, my instinct to protect her career, to protect the department, to protect the optics. I looked at the stacks of papers on my desk and thought, with a sudden sour clarity, about how often I'd protected Lena at my own expense. The dinners I'd canceled because she needed to network. The weekends I'd spent doing extra grading so she could travel. The way I'd nodded along when she said, "You understand, right?" as if understanding was the same thing as consenting. I understand, I said to Sloane. But my role is not to be a blank check for misconduct. There was a silence. Then Sloane's voice cooled into professional finality. Very well, Dr. Calloway. Please email the documentation to the dean's office by morning. I will, I said. I hung up. For a long moment, I just sat there, listening to the building breathe. Then I opened a new email, attached the statements, the screenshots, the photo of Lena and Gideon tagged at the hotel, and wrote a short, factual message. Unauthorized charges on joint and university travel accounts appear to be funding an undisclosed companion. I have revoked my authorization accordingly. I have not restricted Dr. Calloway's personal accounts. Please advise Dr. Calloway to resolve her private arrangements. I didn't add emotion. The truth didn't need decoration. I hit send. The next 2 days were a storm of messages that traced a predictable arc. At first, Lena was furious. Lena, how could you embarrass me like this? Lena, do you know what you've done to my keynote week? Then, bargaining. Lena, just turn it back on and we'll talk when I'm home. The university is not obligated to cover personal expenses incurred by an undisclosed guest. The hotel can work with Dr. Calloway and the other individual. I heard Sloane inhale. I will relay that, she said carefully. But, Dr. Calloway is a high-profile faculty member. There are reputational concerns. Of course there were. There always are. And this was the moment Lena had counted on, my instinct to protect her career, to protect the department, to protect the optics. I looked at the stacks of papers on my desk and thought, with a sudden sour clarity, about how often I'd protected Lena at my own expense. The dinners I'd canceled because she needed to network. The weekends I'd spent doing extra grading so she could travel. The way I'd nodded along when she said, "You understand, right?" as if understanding was the same thing as consenting. I understand, I said to Sloane. But my role is not to be a blank check for misconduct. There was a silence. Then Sloane's voice cooled into professional finality. Very well, Dr. Calloway. Please email the documentation to the dean's office by morning. I will, I said. I hung up. For a long moment, I just sat there, listening to the building breathe. Then I opened a new email, attached the statements, the screenshots, the photo of Lena and Gideon tagged at the hotel, and wrote a short, factual message. Unauthorized charges on joint and university travel accounts appear to be funding an undisclosed companion. I have revoked my authorization accordingly. I have not restricted Dr. Calloway's personal accounts. Please advise Dr. Calloway to resolve her private arrangements. I didn't add emotion. The truth didn't need decoration. I hit send. The next 2 days were a storm of messages that traced a predictable arc. At first, Lena was furious. Lena, how could you embarrass me like this? Lena, do you know what you've done to my keynote week? Then, bargaining. Lena, just turn it back on and we'll talk when I'm home. Then, blame. Lena, you're punishing me because you're insecure. Then, finally, desperation. Lena, I'm stuck. They're not letting us leave without settling the bill. Please. Us again. The us no longer included me. I replied only once, and my reply was simple. Me, ask the person you chose to share the suite with. She didn't answer after that. On the 4th day, the symposium ended. Lena did not return on her scheduled flight. Instead, she came home 2 days later, on a different airline, at an hour when the campus was quiet and the neighbors wouldn't notice. It was late afternoon when I heard the key in the lock. I was in the kitchen, making coffee I didn't want, just to have something warm to hold. The house smelled like bitter grounds and dish soap. Outside, the trees in our yard were losing their leaves in slow, indifferent drifts. The door opened. A suitcase rolled over the threshold with a soft thump. Then Lena stepped into the entryway. She looked like someone who'd tried to rehearse a speech and lost the script. Her hair was pulled back too tightly. Her eyes were tired, not from travel but from containment, like she'd been holding herself together by force. She saw me and stopped. For a second, neither of us moved. The silence between us felt thick, like fog. Nathan, she said quietly. I nodded once. Lena. Her throat bobbed. Can we talk? We're talking, I said. She flinched at the flatness in my voice. I didn't plan this, she said quickly. The sentence came out like it had been waiting behind her teeth for days. I swear to you, I didn't plan it. Gideon was there. He reached out months ago about collaborating again, and I ignored it. But then he showed up at the symposium, and it was like, she spread her hands, helpless. It was like stepping into an old room. Familiar. Easy. Easy. The word struck me harder than any explicit confession. And lying to me was easy too. I asked. She winced. I didn't want to stress you. Then, blame. Lena, you're punishing me because you're insecure. Then, finally, desperation. Lena, I'm stuck. They're not letting us leave without settling the bill. Please. Us again. The us no longer included me. I replied only once, and my reply was simple. Me, ask the person you chose to share the suite with. She didn't answer after that. On the fourth day, the symposium ended. Lena did not return on her scheduled flight. Instead, she came home 2 days later, on a different airline, at an hour when the campus was quiet and the neighbors wouldn't notice. It was late afternoon when I heard the key in the lock. I was in the kitchen, making coffee I didn't want, just to have something warm to hold. The house smelled like bitter grounds and dish soap. Outside, the trees in our yard were losing their leaves in slow, indifferent drifts. The door opened. A suitcase rolled over the threshold with a soft thump. Then Lena stepped into the entryway. She looked like someone who'd tried to rehearse a speech and lost the script. Her hair was pulled back too tightly. Her eyes were tired, not from travel but from containment, like she'd been holding herself together by force. She saw me and stopped. For a second, neither of us moved. The silence between us felt thick, like fog. Nathan, she said quietly. I nodded once. Lena. Her throat bobbed. Can we talk? We're talking, I said. She flinched at the flatness in my voice. I didn't plan this, she said quickly. The sentence came out like it had been waiting behind her teeth for days. I swear to you, I didn't plan it. Gideon was there. He reached out months ago about collaborating again, and I ignored it. But then he showed up at the symposium, and it was like, she spread her hands, helpless. It was like stepping into an old room. Familiar. Easy. Easy. The word struck me harder than any explicit confession. And lying to me was easy too. I asked. She winced. I didn't want to stress you. Her eyes filled with tears. The worst part, I continued, is that you let me fund it and then tried to make me the villain when I stopped. She covered her mouth with her hand, a reflex to keep something inside. A sob, maybe. Or a defense. I was going to tell you, she whispered. I nodded. I know. The calmness in my response seemed to devastate her more than anger would have. Because anger implies hope, implies engagement. Calmness implies the decision has already been made. She stepped forward. Please, she said, voice shaking. Please don't do this. We can go to counseling. I'll cut him off. I'll transfer my accounts. I'll make it right. Make it right. The phrase sounded like someone trying to undo a broken glass by apologizing to the floor. I looked at her and felt a grief that was clean and sharp. I've already separated the finances, I said. Her eyes widened. What? I moved my portion of our joint savings into an account only I control, I said. The remaining balance stays temporarily to cover legal and administrative costs. I'm not leaving you with nothing. I'm leaving you with the consequences of your choices. Lena swayed slightly, like the room had shifted. You decided this without me. You decided a lot without me, I said. She stared at me, tears spilling now. I made a mistake. You made a series of decisions, I said, and my voice stayed even. A mistake is bumping into someone in the hallway. Booking a suite, accepting a guest, charging couple services, lying for days, that's not a mistake. That's a plan you didn't want to name. Lena's shoulders shook. She sank into a chair at the table, folding into herself like a paper figure. I didn't think you'd be like this, she whispered. Like what? I asked. So, cold. I considered that. I thought about how many times I'd let her intensity set the temperature in our marriage. How many times I'd warmed myself by being useful. How much of my identity had been the stable one.